Good evening to the night owls. Good afternoon to the day walkers. And good morning to the rising dead. Welcome to Classified Culture. If you enjoy science fiction and horror stories, then you've come to the right channel. Our goal is to provide quality and original stories for listeners on a regular basis. Every day there will be at least one or two new stories for your listening pleasure. Help this channel grow as a community. You can help by sharing this video, giving it a like, leaving a message in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel. Your feedback and support is always appreciated. Well, I suppose that's enough said for now. It's time for me to do what you all have been waiting for. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. Helena Graves stepped out of her car, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the Appalachian night like a knife. The abandoned forest ranger station loomed before her, its once pristine wood now weathered to a sickly gray, like a decaying tooth exposed by a gaping smile. She'd driven off the main road onto this barely there dirt track after picking up an unexplained transmission on her ham radio, a signal that seemed to whisper her name with static urgency. The station's silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the rhythmic tapping of rain against leaves. Helena shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The chill seeped into her bones, but it wasn't just the cold that made her teeth chatter. She'd felt this prickling unease before, the sensation of being watched from the shadows, but she'd never been able to trace its source. She approached the station cautiously, her boots squelching in mud. The door creaked open at her touch, as if inviting her inside. The stench that greeted her was overwhelming, a mix of decay and something else, something organic and rank, like rotting meat left out too long. She gagged, bile rising in her throat, but she forced herself to breathe through her mouth and step inside. The flashlight beam danced over peeling wallpaper and broken furniture, illuminating dust motes that swirled like tiny, pissed-off ghosts. Everything was coated in a thick layer of grime, except for one room, the radio room. It was pristine, almost sterile, as if it had been freshly cleaned mere moments ago. The air in there held none of the decaying stench from outside. Instead, it smelled faintly of ozone and metallic tang, like a storm about to break. Helena approached the radio console, running her fingers over the dust-free surface. She could still feel the hum of power beneath her fingertips, even though the station should have been defunct for decades. She flicked on the transmitter, its switches clicking under her touch with a comforting familiarity. Then she sat down, switching on the receiver to listen. Static hissed from the speakers, but it wasn't long before another voice joined it. Hers. Helena Graves. Helena Graves. Helena Graves. It whispered through the darkness, the words punctuated by bursts of white noise that sounded almost like breathing. She shuddered, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Suddenly, there was silence. Then, a wet dragging sound echoed through the walls, making Helena's skin crawl. It was rhythmic, insistent, like something large and heavy being pulled along rough ground. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a soft, moist squelching. Her body moved before she could command it, propelling her away from the console towards the door. But as she reached for the handle, the dragging sound stopped abruptly. In its place was silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, not even her own heartbeat. It was as if the world had held its breath. Then, a faint tapping started up behind her. Tap, 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 like fingers drumming on glass. She turned slowly, her body trembling with each beat of her heart. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like 1,000 tiny fists pounding against the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Panic surged through her veins, hot and urgent. She had to get out. Now. But as she spun back towards the door, she found herself staring into a pair of milky white eyes floating in the darkness. They were suspended mid-air, about eye level with hers, and they blinked slowly, deliberately, as if mocking her terror. Helena screamed, backing away until she collided with something solid, a body, standing behind her. She gasped, feeling cold hands grasp her shoulders, their grip like ice on her skin. She struggled to break free, but the hands held firm, pulling her closer until she could feel the damp breath of another person on her neck. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The tapping ceased, the dragging sound disappeared, and the milky eyes blinked once more before fading into darkness. Helena's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out all other sounds except for one, a wet, uneven breathing that seemed to echo from within her own body. She waited, breath held captive in her lungs, until finally she couldn't take it anymore. She wrenched free of the icy grip and fled, stumbling blindly through the dark ranger station, driven by primal instinct alone. The door flew open at her touch, and she tumbled out into the night, gasping for air like a drowning woman. Her car was waiting where she'd left it, but as she reached for the handle, she noticed something strange. The driver's side window was rolled down, even though she could have sworn she'd left it up. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay a single white rose, its petals soft and unfurled, as if freshly picked. A chill ran through her, colder than any she'd felt before. This wasn't right. None of this was right. She should leave now, drive far away from this godforsaken place, and never look back. But something held her rooted to the spot, a certainty that it was already too late for escape. Because out here in the dark, something had heard her name, and it knew where she lived. Helena stood at the door of her car, the white rose trembling in her hand like a small, fragile bone. She couldn't take her eyes off it, this intrusion into her otherwise orderly life. It was as if the very air around her had grown thick with dread, each breath heavier than the last, tasting of damp earth and decay. She climbed into the driver's seat, the rose still clutched in her fingers, and reached for the door handle to pull it shut. But something stopped her. A sound, faint but distinct, coming from within the station. A rhythmic thudding, like a heart beating slowly against wood. The tapping had started again. She froze, listening hard, trying to pinpoint its exact location. It seemed to echo through the entire building, vibrating in the walls, the floorboards, her very bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped, but not completely. There was another sound now. Something wet and sticky, like flesh being dragged along rough surfaces. Her body responded before she could think, her foot slamming down on the accelerator even as her hands wrenched the steering wheel around. The car lurched forward, its tires spinning wildly in the mud before finding purchase and sending it careening down the track towards the main road. She didn't look back, couldn't bring herself to glance into the rearview mirror, not with that sound still ringing in her ears. It was only once she'd put several miles between herself and the station that she allowed herself to slow down, pulling onto the shoulder of the narrow highway and switching off the engine. Her hands were shaking, the steering wheel slick with sweat beneath them. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but it caught in her throat as she inhaled something foul. The smell of decay, ripe and heavy, filling the car like a rotting carcass left too long in the sun. Helena gagged, leaning out the open window to suck in fresh air, only to find that the stench was everywhere. It clung to her clothes, filled her nostrils, coated her tongue with its putrid taste. She couldn't escape it, not even here in the middle of nowhere, under the vast expanse of stars overhead. She knew then that she wouldn't be able to leave it behind, this horror that had followed her out from the ranger station. It was inside her now, like a parasite burrowing deep into her flesh, festering there until it consumed her entirely. She could feel its influence already, the fear beginning to morph into something else. A strange sort of curiosity, a macabre fascination with what lay hidden within those decaying walls. And so, despite everything screaming inside her not to, she found herself turning the car around and driving back towards the station, drawn inexorably by some dark force she couldn't quite understand. As she approached, the smell grew stronger still, so potent it seemed to seep into every pore of her skin, making her feel tainted, unclean. The interior light cast eerie shadows across the decaying facade as she stepped out onto the crumbling driveway. She could hear something now too, a faint whispering sound that seemed to follow her wherever she went. It was like the very wind itself was speaking, murmuring dark secrets it had carried on its breath for decades. The door creaked open at her touch, revealing the familiar darkness within. But this time there was something else too. A faint light flickering deep inside the building, casting long, dancing shadows across the rotted walls. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, drawn irresistibly towards that glowing beacon like a moth to flame. As she moved deeper into the station, Helena realized with mounting unease that the smell wasn't just coming from the decaying walls anymore. It was also emanating from behind closed doors, seeping out from beneath them in thick, choking waves. And yet, despite its intensity, there was something strangely familiar about it too. A scent she couldn't quite place, but which seemed to stir long-forgotten memories deep within her subconscious. She reached out tentatively towards the first door, her fingers brushing against the cold metal handle before pausing. What lay beyond it? More decay? Or perhaps something far worse? A sudden surge of panic threatened to overwhelm her, urging her to turn tail and flee while she still could. But it was too late for that now. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. With a trembling hand, Helena pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was long abandoned, its contents left to rot over time. But unlike the rest of the station, this room didn't smell of decay. Instead, it carried the scent of freshly turned earth, rich and damp, filling her nostrils with its pungent aroma. It was as if the very air within these walls had been preserved somehow, locked away behind closed doors until now. Her eyes scanned the contents of the room. An old desk, its surface covered in dust, except for one small area where something had been recently moved. A bookshelf filled with tattered tomes, their spines bearing titles like Rituals of Purification and Communion with the Other. A blackboard upon which was written in neat, precise letters, Rules for Living. Helena approached the desk cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Laid out neatly before her were several large ledgers, their pages yellowed with age, but otherwise pristine, as if they'd been cared for diligently over time. She opened the first one, its spine creaking softly beneath her touch, and began to read. The handwriting was neat, almost delicate, each letter carefully formed, as if by someone who took great pride in their work. But it was the content that truly caught her attention. Rules and rituals laid out in meticulous detail, describing everything from how one should bathe before sunrise, with water drawn from the well at midnight, to what foods were acceptable to eat during certain phases of the moon. As she flipped through the pages, Helena realized with growing horror that these weren't simply the ramblings of some long-dead cult. No, this was something far more sinister. A system designed to control every aspect of life within the ranger station, to mold its inhabitants into willing participants in whatever dark game they'd been playing here. She reached for the second ledger, her hands shaking as she opened it to find page after page filled with names. Names she didn't recognize at first glance, but which sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. Joanna Blackwood, Jordan Kane, Marcus Weaver, Avery Thompson, Hayden Lewis, Dia Hartley. And then, there it was, the name that made her blood run cold. Helena Graves. Her own name stared back at her from the yellowed page, written in the same neat script as before, followed by a date nearly 20 years ago. She'd been just 12 years old when this ledger had first been opened, her life already mapped out for her without her knowledge or consent. But why? Who were these people? And what did they want with her? A sudden noise from behind made her jump, dropping the ledger onto the desk. Helena's breath caught in her throat as she listened intently to the sound behind her. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A faint dragging noise, like fabric against rough stone. She froze, her mind racing with images of unseen hands pulling themselves along the walls, leaving wet trails in their wake. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence stretching taut until it felt ready to snap. Then, ever so softly, the dragging sound resumed, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping that sent shivers down Helena's spine. Tag, drag, tag. It was as if something was imitating her heartbeat, trying to sync with it, to drown out its own alien rhythm. She forced herself to turn slowly, eyes scanning the shadows cast by the flickering light from the lantern on the desk. The tapping seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls until she couldn't pinpoint its source. But the dragging, that was different. It seemed to follow her gaze, moving through the room like a phantom's touch, always just out of sight. Helena's skin prickled with gooseflesh as an icy draft wrapped itself around her, making her shiver. The smell of decay had returned, stronger this time, a cloying sweetness that coated her tongue and made her stomach churn. It seemed to emanate from every corner of the room, as if the very air was rotting from within. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, that the tapping and dragging were nothing more than old buildings settling around her. But the certainty that something was terribly wrong refused to leave her mind. This wasn't natural. This was calculated, deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving only the dragging sound in its wake. It seemed louder now, closer somehow, as if whatever was making it had moved nearer while Helena's attention was elsewhere. She could almost feel its presence behind her, its breath hot on the back of her neck, like a physical weight pressing down upon her shoulders. She wanted to run, to flee this place, and never look back. But her feet seemed rooted to the spot, held in place by some unseen force that refused to let her go. Instead, she found herself turning once more, drawn inexorably towards the sound like a moth fluttering helplessly towards a flame. As she turned, she caught sight of something moving out of the corner of her eye, a flash of pale flesh against the darkness of the wall. She blinked, trying to focus on it, but it was gone before she could make out any details. Still, there was no mistaking what she'd seen. Skin splitting where it should not. The dragging sound stopped suddenly, leaving only silence in its wake. Helena's heart pounded in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing through the room as if amplified by some unseen force. She felt lightheaded, her breaths coming in short gasps that did little to satisfy her screaming lungs. Then, just when she thought she could bear it no more, she heard another sound. A soft, wet noise that seemed to originate deep within the walls themselves. It was like nothing she'd ever heard before, yet somehow familiar. It reminded her of the sound of meat being torn from bone, or perhaps the moist sucking sound of mud pulling at boots during a rainstorm. The room grew colder still as the sound continued, filling every corner with its sickening rhythm. Helena could feel it now, not just hear it. A pulsating vibration that seemed to resonate within her very bones, threatening to shake her apart from within. She stumbled back, pressing herself against the desk for support, but even that solid piece of furniture felt somehow insubstantial beneath her touch. The sound reached its crescendo suddenly, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, Helena could hear nothing save for the pounding of her own heart and the rasp of her ragged breath, sawing in and out of her lungs like a dull blade through flesh. Then, slowly at first but building steadily in speed and intensity, the tapping resumed. This time, however, it was accompanied by something else, a wet, slithering noise that seemed to emanate from every surface within the room. Floors, walls, ceiling. It was as if the very fabric of the ranger station had come alive around her, writhing with unseen serpents beneath its decaying skin. Helena's body reacted before her mind could process what was happening. She threw herself away from the desk, scrambling towards the door on hands and knees like a frightened animal. But even as she moved, she knew it was too late, that whatever had been lurking within these walls had already taken hold of her. She could feel it now, deep inside her muscles, That same small, twitching movement that had greeted her upon waking earlier that day. It seemed to originate in her calves this time, spreading upwards through her legs like a rash as she struggled to rise onto unsteady feet. She stumbled forward, catching herself against the doorframe before collapsing onto the floor once more. Helena lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the wet slithering sounds continuing around her, feeling that insidious movement within her own body growing stronger with each passing moment. It was as if something had taken root inside her, burrowing deep into muscle and bone until it became a part of her, an unwanted passenger she couldn't shake off, no matter how hard she tried. She reached out tentatively, fingers brushing against the cold stone floor before curling into fists as she fought against the panic rising within her. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. She was Helena Graves, amateur radio operator and solitary camper, not some unwilling participant in a twisted ritual designed by unseen forces for their own sinister purposes. But even as she denied it to herself, she knew the truth. This had been planned long before she had ever set foot inside the ranger station. They, whoever they were, had been waiting for her, had chosen her specifically for whatever dark game they played here. And now she was a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. A sudden pain in her side made her gasp aloud, drawing her attention back to her own body once more. She looked down, eyes widening in horror, as she saw the skin there splitting open, like overripe fruit, blood welling up from within before spilling forth onto the floor beneath her. It was happening again, that same terrible sensation of something moving beneath her flesh, pushing itself outwards until it broke free entirely. Helena tried to scream but found no air in her lungs with which to do so. Instead, she could only watch helplessly as another small creature emerged from her body, wriggling and twisting like a newborn worm before dropping onto the floor beside her. It looked much like the others, pale, sightless, and covered in a slick sheen of blood and fluid. But there was something different about this one too. This time, it moved on its own. While the others had remained still once they'd emerged from their hosts, this creature seemed alive with movement, squirming across the heat. Helena lay there, her breath ragged and wet, each inhale scraping against her throat like sandpaper. The room seemed to pulse around her, walls throbbing with a heartbeat not quite her own. She tried to focus on anything but the writhing thing beside her, but it was impossible. Every flicker of movement caught her eye, drawing her gaze back again and again. Her hands trembled as she reached out once more, this time not touching stone but fabric, an old photograph, its edges yellowed with age. She picked it up, turning it over to reveal a young girl laughing at the camera, sunlight catching in her hair. It took Helena a moment to realize that the child was herself, frozen in time during some long-forgotten summer. A chill ran through her, colder than any draft could account for. How had this photograph ended up here? Who had taken it? And why? The questions swirled around her like vultures, their cries echoing inside her skull until she felt ready to scream. She searched the floor around her, finding more photographs scattered haphazardly across the stone, all of herself at different ages. Helena in her first communion dress, staring solemnly into the lens. Helena again, this time grinning mischievously as she held up a fish caught on a line too small for it. And finally, Helena as a teenager, arms wrapped protectively around a younger child who bore an uncanny resemblance to herself. Each photograph felt like a punch to her gut, driving the air from her lungs until she gasped for breath like a beached whale. This was no random selection of images. Someone had gone through great lengths to compile them, to document her life in meticulous detail, and that someone knew her, knew where to find these moments stolen from time. Helena hugged herself tightly, trying to ward off the sudden sensation of being watched, not just now, but throughout her entire life. It was as if eyes had always been on her, tracking her every movement, cataloging each moment of joy and sorrow alike. The feeling was nauseating, a physical weight pressing down upon her chest until she could barely draw a breath. She needed to find out who had done this, why they'd brought her here. But more than that, she needed to know if anyone else knew about these eyes following her every move. Were there others like her? Unwitting pawns in some grand scheme orchestrated by unseen hands? With a grunt, Helena pushed herself up from the floor, ignoring the protest of her muscles and the fresh wave of pain coursing through her body. She had to keep moving, had to find answers before whatever was happening inside her drove her completely mad. The room seemed different now, shifted somehow since she'd last noticed it. The walls appeared closer, closing in around her like a vice designed specifically to crush the life from her bones. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, writhing and twisting into shapes that made no sense, but still sent shivers down her spine. Her breath came faster now, wetter, each exhale fogging up before her eyes until she could barely see through it. It was as if her very insides were rotting away, decaying from within until nothing remained but this sickening wetness that filled her lungs and coated her tongue. She stumbled forward, one hand trailing along the wall for support, while the other clutched at the photographs like a lifeline. The dragging sound had resumed, louder now, echoing through the station as if mocking her attempts to escape it. It seemed to follow her, moving with her footsteps until she couldn't tell whether it was coming from ahead or behind. A sudden chill ran down her spine, colder than anything she'd felt thus far. She turned slowly, heart pounding in her chest like a drum, and saw something pale moving just beyond the reach of her light. It was there one moment, gone the next, disappearing into the shadows before she could get a good look at it. But she didn't need to see it clearly to know what it was. Those things were everywhere now, writhing beneath her skin, filling her ears with their wet whispers. They were inside her, outside her, all around her, an inescapable prison of flesh and bone. Helena leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, as another wave of pain washed over her. She felt something shift within her belly, something large and heavy, moving through muscle and sinew, until it found its way out into the open air once more. She looked down, eyes wide with horror, as she watched another creature emerge from her body. This one larger than any before it. It was like a grotesque parody of childbirth, each contraction sending waves of agony crashing through her until she thought she might pass out from the sheer force of it. And then, finally, it was done. The thing lay there on the floor beside her, its body slick with blood and fluid, limbs twitching sporadically as if trying to remember how to move properly. It was a monster, plain and simple, but more than that, it was hers, a part of her, born from her own flesh and blood. Helena felt something snap inside her then, some vital thread connecting mind to body, severed completely. She knew she should be screaming, should be tearing at her clothes, digging at her skin with her nails until there was nothing left but red ruin. But instead, she found herself staring down at that thing with an almost clinical detachment. This is what they wanted, she realized suddenly. This was the purpose behind everything. The photographs, the dragging sounds, the endless torment of her body and mind. They had chosen her specifically because they knew she would be able to bear it, could endure the endless nightmare until there was nothing left but acceptance. And so she stood there, bathed in the dim glow of her flashlight, watching as the creature beside her began to move once more. Its limbs twitched, then spasmed, before finally coordinating enough to pull itself upright onto unsteady feet. It turned towards her, those sightless eyes seeming to bore into hers with an intensity that made her shiver. And then it spoke. Its voice was wet, guttural, like liquid forced through a strainer filled with grave dirt. But even so, Helena recognized the words instantly. "Helena," it whispered, lips curled back in what might have been a smile, or perhaps merely a grotesque parody thereof. "You're home now." She stood there for several long moments, unable to move, unable even to breathe. The room seemed to sway around her, walls pulsating like the heart of some ancient beast preparing to swallow her whole. But despite the terror threatening to consume her entirely, Helena felt something else too, a warmth spreading through her chest, filling her with a sense of belonging she'd never known before. This was where she belonged. Here among these twisted creatures born from her own body, her own pain. Here, finally, was somewhere she could call home. And so she stayed there, rooted to the spot. As more creatures emerged from the shadows around her, they came crawling out of the walls, sliding along the floor on bellies slick with blood and fluid, each one moving with an uncanny grace. Helena stood there, staring at the creature that had once been a part of her, now standing upright with an unnatural stillness. Its limbs hung loosely at its sides, but every so often, they would twitch or spasm, as if receiving commands from some unseen puppeteer. The room was filled with the damp smell of earth and decay, like a freshly dug grave open to the night air. She felt her breath coming in ragged gasps, each inhale drawing the fetid scent deeper into her lungs. It was as if she could taste the rot on her tongue, feel it coating her throat like phlegm. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, threatening to burst free from its cage of bone and flesh. And then, without warning, it spoke again. "Helena," it rasped, voice echoing through the room like a sickening parody of static on her radio. "You cannot leave us now." A chill ran down Helena's spine at those words, raising gooseflesh on her arms, despite the stifling heat of the room. She knew they were right. She couldn't just walk away from this. Whatever was happening here, whatever had been done to her, it was tied to these creatures, to this place, and until she understood it fully, she would be a prisoner. With a shuddering breath, Helena turned back towards the door leading out of the room. She had to keep moving, had to find answers if she hoped to survive this ordeal. But as she took her first step forward, the creature lunged at her, jaws snapping mere inches from her face. She stumbled backwards with a cry, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the floor. The creature loomed above her, its body jerking spasmodically, as if controlled by some unseen force. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped moving entirely. It stood there, perfectly still, eyes fixed on Helena with an unsettling intensity. Helena scrambled back away from it, her heart racing wildly in her chest. She could feel the panic rising within her, threatening to consume her completely if she let it. But she refused to give in to fear. She had come too far, endured too much to succumb now. She forced herself to take deep breaths, focusing on the sensation of air moving in and out of her lungs, rather than the terror clawing at the edges of her mind. And as she did so, she noticed something strange. The room seemed to be expanding around her. The walls that had once felt like they were closing in on her now appeared to retreat slightly, granting her a little more space. It was then that she heard it again, the sound of wet flesh dragging against floorboards, coming from somewhere deeper within the station. She shuddered at the noise, her skin crawling with revulsion as she tried to pinpoint its exact location. As if responding to her thoughts, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be moving closer, drawing nearer with each passing second. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped entirely. Silence fell like a shroud over the room, so complete that Helena could hear nothing but the beating of her own heart echoing in her ears. And then, without warning, her radio crackled to life. "Helena," came the voice, distorted by static but still unmistakably human. "We know you're there." She froze, fingers tightening around the flashlight she still held clutched in one hand. She wanted to respond, to demand answers from whoever was speaking to her through that godforsaken device, but no words would come. All she could do was listen as the voice continued. "You cannot leave us now," it said again, echoing the creature's earlier words with chilling accuracy. "You belong to us, Helena. You always have." Helena felt something inside her snap at those words, some vital thread connecting mind to body severed completely. She let out a cry, half rage, half despair, and hurled the radio across the room with all her might. It smashed against the far wall with a satisfying crunch of shattered plastic and broken circuitry. But even as it did so, Helena knew it wouldn't make any difference. Because they were right. She couldn't leave them now. Not until she'd faced whatever truth lay hidden at the heart of this nightmare. She pushed herself back up onto her feet, hands shaking with adrenaline and fear as she shone her flashlight around the room once more. And that was when she saw it. A door set into the wall opposite, half hidden behind a rotting curtain of cobwebs and decay. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight of it, lungs burning like they were filled with acid rather than air. She knew what lay beyond that door. She could feel it, sense it like a physical presence pressing against her mind from all sides. And yet, despite the terror threatening to consume her entirely, she also knew she had no choice but to face whatever lay waiting for her there. With a deep breath, Helena stepped forward towards the door, hand reaching out tentatively to grasp the rusted handle. It felt cold beneath her touch, like ice against her skin, and she couldn't help but wonder what horrors awaited her on the other side. As she pulled the door open, revealing the darkness beyond, she thought she heard something move behind her. A wet, slithering sound that sent shivers down her spine and made her want to scream until there was nothing left inside her but silence. But she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to show even the slightest hint of weakness now, not when she stood on the precipice of understanding, teetering on the edge of knowledge that would either save her or destroy her completely. So she stepped through the door, into the darkness beyond, and left whatever creatures might be lurking behind her to their own devices. She had more important things to concern herself with now, more horrifying truths to uncover before this was all over. The door creaked open reluctantly, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into inky blackness. Helena hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped animal. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with decay, carrying with it an undertone of something metallic that made her stomach churn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her breath caught as she inhaled too deeply of the foul-smelling air. Her lungs felt suddenly tight, her chest constricting around them like a vice. She coughed, doubling over, and it was then she noticed the wetness in her mouth, the taste of old pennies and rust. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls as she struggled to regain control of herself. The stone was damp to the touch, covered in a slimy film that seemed to writhe beneath her fingertips. She could hear something moving within it, a wet, squelching sound that made bile rise in her throat. She forced herself to straighten up, shining her light down the stairs. They were steep and narrow, leading down into darkness so complete it seemed almost tangible. There was no rail, nothing to stop her from tumbling headfirst into the abyss if she lost her footing. But she couldn't turn back now, not after coming this far. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead, and began to descend. The stairs were treacherous, each step slick with moisture and moss. Her boots slipped and slid, threatening to send her careening down into the darkness at any moment. But she pressed on, driven by some primal need to know the truth of this place, no matter how horrifying it might be. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight illuminated a long hallway stretching out before her. The walls were bare stone, slick with moisture, and covered in strange symbols carved deep into the rock. They seemed almost organic, like something that had grown there over time rather than being chiseled by human hands. Helena approached them cautiously, running her fingers along the edges of the grooves. They were smooth, worn down by years of dampness and decay. She shone her light on them, trying to make out what they might say or mean, but they were unlike anything she'd ever seen before. As she moved closer still, something caught her eye, a faint movement at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, shining her light towards it, but there was nothing there except more walls and shadows. Yet even as she watched, she could sense something moving within them, writhing just out of sight like worms burrowing beneath skin. A shiver ran down her spine, cold and clammy, as the implications of what she'd seen sank in. These weren't merely symbols carved into the stone. They were wounds, scars left behind by whatever had once occupied this place. And whatever it was, it still lingered here, trapped perhaps, or maybe even worse, waiting. She took a step back, suddenly desperate to leave this horrible place behind. But as she did so, her foot caught on something lying on the floor. She stumbled, falling forward, and threw out her hands to break her fall. They landed in something soft and wet, giving way beneath her touch like rotten flesh. Helena screamed, scrambling back onto her feet, but it was too late. The thing she'd touched had already begun to spread, tendrils of darkness reaching out towards her from all sides. She could feel them moving across her skin, cold and damp, leaving behind a trail of sickness that made her stomach heave. And then, as if summoned by her scream, the wet dragging sound echoed again through the hallway. Louder this time, closer, closer than it had any right to be. Helena shone her light down the corridor, heart pounding in her ears like a drumbeat calling her to flee. But there was nowhere to go, not unless she wanted to risk venturing deeper into the darkness, deeper into whatever horrors lay hidden within these walls. And so she stood frozen, breath coming fast and ragged, as the sound grew louder still, closer still, until it seemed almost as if it were coming from right beside her. Then, just when she thought she couldn't take another second of this unbearable tension, everything went silent, still, as if the very air itself had held its breath in anticipation. And then, suddenly, it happened. A voice echoed through the darkness, speaking directly into Helena's ear, hot and wet and terrible. "You can't leave us now, Helena," it said, mimicking the words of the radio voice earlier. But this time there was no static, no interference, just pure clarity, like a blade pressed against her throat. She spun around, heart leaping into her mouth. But there was nothing there except more shadows and the endless expanse of stone walls stretching out in every direction. Yet even as she stared into the darkness, she could feel something moving within it, something alive and aware and watching her with malevolent intent. A cold sweat broke out across her body, and she found herself suddenly unable to move, rooted to the spot by sheer terror. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even scream. All she could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the unseen presence closed in around her like a shroud. And then, finally, just when she thought she would surely lose her mind entirely, it began again. The wet dragging sound, louder now, closer still, closer than ever before. This time, however, something was different. This time, there was a rhythm to it, a beat that seemed almost rhythmic, as if whatever made that terrible noise was moving to some unheard melody, dancing perhaps, or maybe even. Helena's thoughts were cut off abruptly as the creature stepped into the light of her flashlight. It was tall and thin, its body a writhing mass of limbs and flesh that seemed almost fluid in its movements. Its skin was pale and slick, like something pulled fresh from the deep earth, and its eyes were black pits filled with endless hunger. But it was the sight of its mouth that truly turned Helena's blood to ice within her veins. It was huge, gaping wide enough to swallow her whole, lined with rows upon rows of teeth, sharp, jagged things like broken glass, and dripping with something dark and viscous that smelled like decay and tasted like bile. She stumbled back, horror overwhelming all other thought or feeling, as the creature took another step towards her. Its body seemed to ripple and flow with each movement, like liquid flesh poured into a mold designed by madness itself. And then it spoke again, its voice a wet gurgle deep in its throat. "Helena," it said, her name barely recognizable amidst the slithering sounds of its speech. "You cannot leave us now. You belong to us." She turned and ran, heart pounding wildly, lungs burning with each ragged breath she drew into them. Behind her she could hear the creature's wet dragging sound once more, but this time it was accompanied by something else, laughter. It sounded like water bubbling up from a deep well, cold. Helena bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She gasped for air, but her lungs refused to inflate properly. as if some unseen force was pressing down on them, holding them captive. Her hands flew to her neck, fingers probing at the tender flesh, seeking reassurance that she still drew breath. As her vision adjusted to the dim light filtering through the grimy windows of the ranger station, Helena became aware of an unfamiliar ache in her body. She felt different somehow, heavy and wrong. She threw back the tattered blankets and swung her legs out of bed, only to freeze at the sight of them. They were covered in dried blood, caked into the skin like rusty paint. She staggered to her feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room spun around her, the ancient wallpaper peeling away from the walls in long, serpentine strips that seemed to writhe and twist before her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand to steady herself against the cold stone wall, but her fingers encountered something rough and unfamiliar. Carvings. Her breath caught in her throat as she traced the symbols with numb fingertips. They were the same ones she'd seen downstairs, those organic curves and angles that seemed to defy logic and reason. But there were more of them here, far more than before. And they were deeper too, cut into the stone with a violence that made her stomach churn. But it wasn't just the walls that bore these markings. As she looked down at herself, horror clawed its way up her spine like a physical thing. The same symbols had been etched into her skin, scoring her flesh in neat little rows that seemed almost deliberate. She could see where they'd been cut into her arms and legs, her ribs and hips, even her face, shallow wounds that oozed blood but showed no signs of healing. How? How had this happened? She couldn't remember leaving her bed last night, let alone carving symbols into herself and the walls. But then again, she couldn't remember much of anything after her encounter with whatever it was down in the basement, the creature that had spoken her name and chased her back upstairs. A shiver ran through her at the memory of those black pit eyes, that gaping maw filled with broken glass teeth. She hugged herself tightly, as if that might ward off the chill that seemed to have seeped into her very bones overnight. Helena stumbled towards the bathroom, switching on the harsh fluorescent lights despite knowing they would reveal more than she cared to see. She stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection with a kind of detached horror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, her face pale and gaunt, dark circles ringing her eyes like bruises. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her hair matted and wild. But it was her body that truly drew her gaze. Those deep cuts scored into her flesh like some twisted ritual scarification. She could see now how they'd been made, with precision, with care even, as if whoever, whatever, had done this took pride in their workmanship. As she reached up to touch one of the wounds on her cheek, Helena noticed something else, something that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing through her veins like ice water. Her fingers were still trembling slightly, but it wasn't just fear that caused them to shake. It was something more, something worse. They were moving on their own. It started as a faint twitching at first, barely noticeable beneath the surface of her skin. But then it grew stronger, more insistent, until her whole hand seemed to be writhing like a nest of snakes. She watched in horror as her fingers curled into claws, her wrist twisting at an angle that should have been impossible. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled gurgle. She felt something wet and warm sliding down her chin, realized with distant detachment that she'd bitten through her own lip during her panic. Blood filled her mouth, metallic and thick, choking off her breath. Her body continued its terrible dance, twisting and jerking spasmodically, as if controlled by some unseen puppeteer. She could feel it now, that same sickening presence from downstairs worming its way into her mind, into her flesh. It was inside her, filling her up until there was no room left for anything else. Not even herself. She collapsed to the floor, boneless and limp as a rag doll. Her body lay there for several long moments, twitching occasionally but otherwise still. Then, slowly, deliberately, it began to move again. Only this time, it wasn't her moving at all. Her limbs rose into the air, floating there for a moment before drifting towards the door. She watched in helpless horror as her body stood up, turned around, and started walking out of the bathroom without so much as a backwards glance, leaving her behind. She lay there on the cold tile floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She could feel it now, that terrible certainty that had haunted her dreams last night. Rescue wasn't coming. No one was going to save her from this place, from whatever had taken hold of her body and her mind. She was alone here, utterly alone, with nothing but the darkness for company, and the wet dragging sound echoing through the walls like a funeral dirge. Helena didn't know how long she lay there, listening to that terrible noise as it seemed to grow louder, closer still. But eventually, she managed to drag herself back up onto her feet, leaning heavily against the sink for support. She looked at herself in the mirror once more, searching for some sign of the person she'd been before coming here. But all she saw was a monster. With heavy, deliberate steps, Helena began to make her way downstairs. Each footstep seemed to echo through the entire station like a gunshot, announcing her descent to whatever waited below. She could feel it now, that presence, as if it had reached out and wrapped tendrils of darkness around her very soul. It was waiting for her down there, she knew, waiting to finish what it had started last night. And this time, she wouldn't be running away. She reached the bottom step and stood there for a moment, staring into the gloom that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. Then, with slow, measured movements, she took another step forward, and then another. The wet, dragging sound grew louder still, reverberating off the walls like thunder, until it seemed to fill her very bones with its rhythm. She could feel it now, beating in time with her heart, driving her forward despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not anymore. As she moved deeper into the basement, Helena noticed something else. The air down here was different somehow. Thicker and heavier than before, filled with a scent that made her stomach churn, rotting flesh and damp earth. And something else. Something metallic, like blood. The sound grew louder still, until it seemed to fill her entire being, drowning out all other thought or feeling. She? In the gloom of the basement, Helena's breath began to change. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible even to her own ears, but with each passing moment, it grew wetter, raspier, as if her lungs were filling with fluid. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the task at hand, on navigating the labyrinthine depths of this forsaken place. But the sound was insistent, invasive, like a sick parody of the dragging noise that echoed through the walls. It seemed to mock her, to taunt her with its relentless rhythm, demanding her attention even as she tried to deny it. She could taste it now too, the metallic tang of blood lingering on the back of her tongue, coating her throat with each ragged breath she drew into her lungs. It was the taste of fear, she realized, of dread and desperation. And it was filling her up from the inside out until there was no room left for anything else. Helena felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to let loose all that pent-up terror in one long, ear-splitting wail. But something held her back, some innate sense of self-preservation telling her that if she started screaming down here, she might never stop. That she would lose what little control she had left and be consumed by the darkness entirely. So instead, she bit down hard on her lip until she tasted blood, using the sharp burst of pain to ground herself, to remind herself that she was still alive, still human, for now at least. As she moved deeper into the basement, the air grew colder still, and the smell intensified. It seemed to cling to her skin like a physical weight, filling her nostrils with each breath until she felt sick with it. Decay, yes, but something else too, something almost sweet, like rotting fruit or spoiled milk left out in the sun. It reminded her of something, some half-forgotten memory from her childhood, but before she could grasp at it, the thought slipped away like sand through her fingers. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind, to focus on the here and now rather than getting lost in the murky depths of her own memories. The wet dragging sound seemed to be coming from everywhere now, echoing off the walls with such force that she could feel it vibrating through her very bones. It was like being trapped inside a drum while someone beat relentlessly against its surface, determined to break her apart piece by piece. And maybe they were right, she thought suddenly. Maybe this was what she deserved, what she'd been brought here for. To be broken down into her component parts until there was nothing left but scattered fragments of flesh and bone. Helena stumbled on suddenly, her foot catching on something hidden in the gloom. She went sprawling onto the cold concrete floor, her hands flying out instinctively to catch herself. As she looked up, she saw what had tripped her. An old wooden crate, its lid pried off haphazardly, its contents spilled out across the floor. She could just make out the shapes of bones amidst the rotting straw, small and delicate like those of a child, or perhaps even a dog. Her stomach churned at the sight, but before she could move away, something else caught her eye, a pattern etched into the side of the crate, carved deep into the weathered wood. It was one of the symbols, the same one that had been carved into her flesh last night. Here it was again, staring up at her like an accusing eye, daring her to deny its existence any longer. Helena reached out her trembling hand and traced the lines of the carving with her fingertips. It felt familiar beneath her touch, as if her body remembered it, even if her mind did not. And suddenly she knew. This was where it had started. This was where she had first been marked by whatever force dwelled within these walls. She pulled her hand back sharply, her skin crawling at the thought of touching something so tainted. But it was too late. She could already feel it spreading through her, that awful certainty that she belonged to this place now, that she was a part of it just as it was a part of her. Helena scrambled away from the crate, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as panic clawed at the edges of her mind. She had to get out of here, she realized. She had to find a way to escape before it was too late, before whatever had taken hold of her finished its work. But even as she thought this, she knew deep down that it was already too late, that she would never be free again, not truly, not after everything she'd seen and done here. As if summoned by her thoughts, the wet dragging sound began to change suddenly, growing louder still, until it seemed to fill every inch of the basement like a physical force. And then, just as abruptly, it stopped altogether, leaving behind an oppressive silence that felt almost tangible in its intensity. Helena froze, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that echoed loudly in her ears. She could feel something out there in the darkness with her, she knew. Something ancient and malevolent, and utterly without mercy. It was waiting for her now, she realized, waiting for her to make her move, so it could strike like a snake, swift and deadly and unforgiving. But even as this thought crossed her mind, another followed hard on its heels. What if it wasn't waiting for her at all? What if it had already found her? What if it was inside her right now, whispering in the dark corners of her mind, urging her on towards some terrible conclusion that she could not yet see, but which loomed ever closer nonetheless? Helena felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to laugh, to throw back her head and let loose all the madness that threatened to consume her entirely. But before she could give in to this impulse, another sound caught her attention, a soft scraping noise, barely audible even in the silence. It seemed to be coming from behind her, from somewhere up on the wall perhaps. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows until they fell upon something that made her blood run cold. A series of lines etched into the stone, too regular and deliberate to be anything but another carving. But this one was different. It was unfinished, as if whoever had begun it had been interrupted mid-work. And then she realized what it was supposed to be. A doorway, tall and narrow like those found in ancient churches or catacombs, complete with an archway at the top and even a crude knock-knock pattern etched into the stone on either side. Helena approached cautiously, her heart pounding wildly in her chest as she reached out a tentative hand to trace the lines of the carving. It felt cold beneath her touch, colder even than the surrounding stone, and she could have sworn she felt something shift slightly under her fingers, like a sigh breathed into the depths of the earth itself. Before she could react, however, there was another noise, A sudden wet gasping sound, followed by a sharp intake of breath that seemed to fill the entire room with its force. It took Helena several moments to realize that it. Helena's fingers trembled as she withdrew them from the carving, her mind racing with images of ancient rituals and forbidden rites. The air seemed to grow colder still, if such a thing were possible, and she could feel an inexplicable pressure building in the room, like the very atmosphere was closing in around her. The wet gasping sound came again, louder this time, closer, and Helena whirled around just as something cold and damp brushed against her ankle. She staggered back with a cry, her heart pounding wildly as she fumbled for her flashlight, sweeping its beam across the floor until it fell upon whatever had touched her. It was a hand, pale and gaunt. The skin stretched taut over the bones like parchment. It belonged to a figure huddled in the corner, half hidden by shadows and the detritus of decades. A face looked up at her, or what remained of one. Sunken eyes staring from sockets filled with darkness, a mouth twisted into a silent scream, teeth bared in a grimace that seemed almost accusatory. Helena stumbled backwards, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure wore the same uniform as the one she'd found upstairs, the forest ranger's outfit. But this one had been desecrated, torn and stained with something dark and viscous that Helena could only pray was not blood. As she watched, horrified, the figure began to convulse, its limbs jerking spasmodically as if controlled by some unseen force. Its mouth opened wide, wider still, until it seemed like it would split completely in two, and then a sound emerged from deep within its throat, a wet, dragging noise that was almost familiar now. The sound grew louder, filling the room with its sickening rhythm, and Helena felt something cold and hard form in the pit of her stomach. She knew this sound, had heard it before in these very walls. It was the same noise that had tormented her since she first arrived at the station, the one that seemed to follow her wherever she went. And now, here it was again, issuing forth from the rotting corpse of a man who should have been long dead, a man who, judging by his uniform, had once been just like Helena. An innocent caught up in something ancient and terrible and beyond comprehension. The realization struck her like a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs and sending her reeling backwards until she collided with the wall behind her. She slid down it slowly, her legs no longer able to support her weight as she stared at the writhing figure before her, horror etched onto every line of her face. This was what awaited her if she resisted, wasn't it? This was the punishment for those who dared defy the will of whatever malevolent force held sway over this place. She could see it now, clear as day. The carvings on the wall were not merely symbols or markings, but warnings, etched into stone by hands long turned to dust. And she had ignored them, dismissed them even, too blind and arrogant to see what was right before her eyes. But no more. Now she knew, truly knew, the price of defiance, and it filled her with a terror so profound that it seemed almost like a physical thing, pressing down upon her chest until she could barely breathe. A wet, tearing sound echoed through the room, and Helena looked up just as the figure's arm snapped clean off at the elbow. It twitched and spasmed on the floor for several moments before coming to rest. But the body itself continued its relentless movement, undeterred by this sudden dismemberment. Helena watched in fascinated horror as the leg closest to her began to bend backwards, the knee joint popping audibly under the strain until it was forced completely out of its socket. The bone snapped with a sickening crunch, sending splinters of white flying through the air like shards of glass, but still, the body did not stop. It seemed almost as if something were animating it from within, some unseen force driving it ever onwards towards its terrible purpose. And then, with a sudden and terrible clarity, Helena realized what that purpose was. It was her. It had always been her. She was the reason for all this, the cause of these atrocities committed against flesh and bone and spirit alike. She had been chosen long before she even knew about this place, marked out as some kind of sacrifice to whatever dark god ruled over these woods. The knowledge filled her with a revulsion so profound that it threatened to consume her entirely. But even as she fought against the urge to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, another realization struck her. None of this was new. It wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. She was simply the latest in a long line of victims, each one brought here for the same purpose, each one failing and being consumed by whatever force held sway over this place. The ranger whose body lay rotting before her was proof enough of that. But so too were the bones she'd found earlier. The carvings on the walls, even the very air itself seemed heavy with the weight of all those who had gone before. And now, it was her turn. She could feel it, almost like a physical thing, pressing down upon her shoulders, pushing her ever closer to that terrible edge where resistance became futility and submission became survival. She remembered then the symbol carved into her flesh, the one she dismissed as some kind of morbid prank, but which now seemed more like a brand. A mark of ownership, perhaps, or maybe even a warning. A sign that she belonged to something ancient and terrible, something that would not let her go until it was done with her. A wet dragging sound filled the room once more, and Helena looked up just as the figure's remaining arm began to move, reaching out towards her with fingers curled into talons. She could see now that its nails were sharpened into points, like those of a wild animal, and she knew without a doubt that they would tear through flesh as easily as paper. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, another sensation began to make itself known. A strange kind of acceptance, almost resignation. Itty? In the silence that followed, Helena's breath came in ragged gasps, each one wet and uneven, as if her very lungs were filling with fluid. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls themselves seeming to pulse with a sickening rhythm that echoed the beating of her own heart. She could feel it now, that terrible force that had been pushing at the edges of her mind since she arrived, pressing down upon her with an almost physical weight. She remembered then the words carved into the wall, the ones she'd thought were some kind of ancient ritual. "Welcome home, Helena Graves." And suddenly, she knew what she must do. It was the only way to make it stop, the only way to end this terrible game once and for all. With trembling hands, she reached up and traced the symbol carved into her flesh, feeling the raised edges like the scar tissue they were. Then, with a cry that was half sob, half warrior's battle cry, she began to press her fingers into the soft flesh around it, digging deeper and deeper until blood flowed freely, painting her hands red. The pain was exquisite, but it was also liberating. For the first time since she'd arrived at this godforsaken place, Helena felt like she had some control over what was happening to her. She could choose this, embrace it even, instead of being its victim. As she continued to dig into her own flesh, the wet, dragging sound in the walls seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it approved of her actions. And then, with a final cry that echoed through the room like a gunshot, Helena drove her fingers deep enough to reach bone. Blood poured from the wound now, running down her arms and dripping onto the floor below. She could feel her heart racing, hear it pounding in her ears like a drum, and knew that she was on the verge of passing out. But she didn't care. This was what she wanted, what she had chosen, to be consumed by this place, to become a part of it forever. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The dragging sound in the walls ceased abruptly, leaving only silence behind. Helena's breath caught in her throat, hanging there like a question mark, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But nothing did. There was no transformation, no revelation, just an emptiness so profound that it threatened to consume her entirely. And then, with a final gasp that sounded almost like relief, Helena Graves fell silent forever. In the stillness that followed, the only sound was the distant tapping of water dripping somewhere far overhead. The room seemed different now, smaller somehow, as if all the horror had been squeezed out of it, leaving behind nothing but empty walls and echoes of long-forgotten screams. But even as Helena lay there, her life's blood seeping into the floorboards beneath her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, something ancient and terrible, something that would never let her go completely. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, a voice spoke her name. Helena Graves, it whispered over and over again, like a litany. And with a sudden, chilling realization, Helena understood that she had not escaped at all. She had been chosen long before she even knew about this place, marked out as part of something ancient and terrible, something that would never let her go. The transmission ended with her own voice repeating, "Welcome home, Helena Graves," before falling silent forever. And as the final words echoed through the empty room, it became clear that there were some things from which there was no escape. Some fates were sealed not by chance or choice, but by something far more terrifying, destiny itself. Helena's eyes fluttered open to find herself back in her car, parked at the edge of the woods where she had first entered. The engine was still running, and the clock on the dashboard read 3:00 p.m., exactly 12 hours since she'd set foot into the forest. She looked down at her hands, expecting to see them covered in blood and raw flesh, but they were pristine, unmarked by any wound. Panic surged through her as she frantically checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. The symbol was gone from her forehead, replaced only by smooth, unblemished skin. She stumbled out of the car, falling to her knees on the damp earth, gasping for breath as if she'd been underwater too long. The forest loomed before her, silent and untouched, no sign of the horrors she'd witnessed inside. She reached out tentatively, touching the rough bark of a tree. It felt real, solid, but then so had everything else in that nightmare. Helena turned back to her car, hands shaking as she gripped the door handle. As she opened it, she caught sight of something on the seat, a small, tattered notebook. She picked it up, flipping through pages filled with handwriting that seemed familiar yet strange. It was hers, but not quite. The words were disjointed, fragmented thoughts about rituals, symbols, and a voice whispering her name. At the very end, there was one final entry, "Welcome home, Helena Graves." Beneath it, a crude drawing of the symbol she'd seen, carved into flesh, walls, and bone. And then, scrawled in shaking lines, the words, "I am not myself anymore." A chill ran down her spine as she remembered the voice echoing through the empty room after she'd collapsed. "Welcome home, Helena Graves." Had that been her own voice? Or something else entirely? Helena tore out the page, crumpling it in her fist before tossing it onto the forest floor. She climbed into her car, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it, as if that could keep whatever was out there at bay. As she drove away, she caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror once more. Her eyes seemed different somehow. Darker, maybe? Or perhaps it was just her imagination playing tricks on her again. Because now, more than ever, Helena wasn't sure what was real and what was not. And as she pulled onto the highway, leaving the woods behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Something ancient and terrible, whispering her name over and over again, like a twisted lullaby. Helena Graves. Helena Graves. Until there was nothing left but silence, and the chilling realization that some things could never truly escape their fate.